Hello everybody and welcome back to the Winning Agenda's Twilight Struggle introductory series. My name's Jesse Marshall. It's great to be here with the mid-war cards this time. First things first, for those of you who've been watching the Winning Agenda's videos for a while, you'll notice that we use the Collector's Edition card art. This is something that you can unlock on Playdeck using a downloadable content update if you want to. I personally really like the Collector's Edition card art. They're sort of a little bit different and a lot of them tend to be photographs rather than logos. I mean, you do still have some logos like this OAS founded one, but in general, I find it a bit more of an immersive experience. And once you've unlocked that DLC, you can find the original edition versus the Collector's Edition options here in the card gallery. You can see here the difference if we're just looking at the mid-war US cards, for example. This might take a moment to load, but once it loads up, you'll be able to see that the cards look a little bit different. Yeah, so you can see the art's a little bit smaller. Some of it includes like Alliance for Progress, this just sort of general picture of South America and Central America, whereas the Collector's Edition version has this sweet photograph instead. And a lot of the photographs in the Collector's Edition version tend to be a little larger on the card. So anyway, I just like the card layout a bit better, and that's the first thing I wanted to point out, because on my older videos, I did get quite a lot of comments of people saying, why do your cards look strange? So anyway, that's the answer to that question. This video is going to be a little bit longer than our early war video just because there are so many more cards in the mid-war pack. Not only are there more cards, but I guess by the time you get to this stage of the game, you'll notice that your games tend to branch in a lot of different directions. So that's not to say that there aren't still some sort of best use cases for all of these cards, and some of them are quite straightforward. If you draw them, you tend to play them in a similar way each game. However, some of them you'll play in vastly different ways. I mean, that happens in early war as well. But because in the early war, you're only contesting 3 regions on the board, mainly, Europe, Middle East, and Asia. In the mid-war, you're contesting all 6 regions, and so your plays tend to be a little more disparate, and also the cards impact more regions and give you more options as to how to play them. So we'll come to all of that as we go through, but I just wanted to sort of foreground a bit that this discussion may take a little bit longer than our early war discussion because of the volume of the cards, but we'll try and get through at a decent pace nonetheless. So the first card in the US mid-war deck is Nuclear Subs. So it's a 2 operations card for the US, and it's starred, so it gets removed from play if it's used for the event. And it says, US coup attempts in battleground countries do not affect the DEFCON track for the remainder of the turn. Does not affect Cuban Missile Crisis, which is also in the mid-war deck, and we'll come to in a moment. So ignoring that last bit of the text in brackets, what this card basically says is the US player can coup battleground countries without risking degrading DEFCON. So if DEFCON is at 2, the US player can continue to make coups in battleground countries, and they're not going to lose the game because DEFCON's not going to go down to 1. It's worth noting with Nuclear Subs that the US player can still only coup in areas where DEFCON allows them to in terms of the restrictions. So they can't coup in Europe, Asia, or the Middle East because if DEFCON's at 2, whereas if DEFCON's at 3, they can coup in the Middle East, but as soon as it goes down to 2, they still can't coup they can't coup in the Middle East if DEFCON's at 2 because the DEFCON restrictions don't allow them to. So they're able to make coups without lowering DEFCON, but they still have to obey whatever the DEFCON restrictions are that are in place, given where DEFCON is at. And that's something as the USSR player that you can kind of exploit, because if the US headlines Nuclear Subs, which is probably the best way to play it as the US player, because you don't really want to spend an action round doing this because it's quite a tempo hit. If you give the USSR player their first action round, then you spend your first action round as the US player eventing Nuclear Subs, they get another action round, and then you maybe get to make your first coup. So it kind of is a bit slow from a tempo perspective, but headlining it means that they only get 1 action round, and then you get to coup. As the USSR player, what you can do is, if the Middle East is not a problem for you, so if you don't mind them couing in the Middle East, you can leave DEFCON at 3, and then just kind of respond to whatever the most important successful coup is that the US player makes in the turn, because although the US player can make coups without degrading DEFCON, and that's an advantage, they also can't degrade DEFCON without the help of some other card. Just by coups, they're not going to degrade DEFCON, so they're not going to deprive you as the USSR player of the opportunity to make further coups in battleground countries. So you can sort of hold back a bit and wait for the most important moment to make your battleground coup for the turn. There are obviously counterplays to that, so the US player could reduce DEFCON to 2 with another card to deny you your coup later. But that's kind of another tempo hit for them if they want to do that. As the USSR player, one way you can play back against this card, if you draw it, you can just play it on your last action round. So they will get one action round because the US player goes last, where they can make a coup without degrading DEFCON. And this is one of those cards where if it was a USSR card, the US player could get rid of it on their last action round and it would do absolutely nothing, much like the debate of containment versus Brezhnev doctrine, which we'll come to in a minute. But because it's a blue card, if the USSR player plays it on their last action round, the US player still gets one use out of it. Nonetheless, it's usually okay to get rid of as the USSR in your last action round. The other way you can get around it is you could, for instance, use the 2 influence when you play it on your last action round as the USSR to break US control of a country and sort of force them to respond. You could also know that they've got a scoring card in hand and then they obviously can't coup because they have to play the scoring card in their last action round. If the US player headlines this, they obviously want to be making as many coups as possible. And if you're the US player, you want to be playing this when the USSR player has, multiple African battlegrounds that you want to coup, because those are good, attractive coup targets that are likely to be successful. It's less good if you're planning on coupping South American or Central American countries, because they're all at least 2 stability, the battleground countries, and you need to be spending a lot of ops, and it's not really an efficient use of ops. So it's sort of a bit of a safety valve, I guess. If you're really far behind and they, for instance, control South America, you might play this just to give yourself a chance to get in, if it's just worth so many victory points that you don't mind being a bit ops inefficient to get in there. But otherwise, it's not something that I tend to do, just sort of headline US nuclear subs and just go for it coupping, because it's quite inefficient. And the USSR player, in terms of their counterplay, can just make problems for you elsewhere on the board, either by breaking your control of countries or by placing influence into dangerous spots that you have to respond to with your own placement of influence, or if you don't, they get a further advantage if you choose to coup instead. So there's lots of play and counterplay with nuclear subs. It's certainly a powerful card, particularly powerful at breaking open Africa because of the 1 stability battleground countries. But other than that, it can be a little bit dicey, and there's certainly counterplay for the USSR player. Colonial rearguards is an exact transposition of decolonization onto a blue card. So it comes out in the mid-war, which is a bit later, and it means that it can perhaps turn up on turn 7, which is maybe after Africa scoring's already come out and it's really late. Unlike decolonization, which will always come out in the early war in one player's hand or another. Colonial rearguards, though, is very powerful, just like decolonization, because although control of Thailand will usually have been sorted out by turn 4, even if this comes into the US player's hand in turn 4, it's unlikely to give them control of Thailand or give them control of many countries in Southeast Asia. But it's also unlikely that the USSR player will have taken, Indonesia. It's possible that if the USSR player didn't get decolonization in the early war, that they haven't got Nigeria. They may not have any influence in Angola or Zaire. And it means that you can, in one action round or a headline phase even, as the US player, perhaps break control of Thailand if the USSR controls it just by, 2 influence. So you can put 1 into Thailand and then perhaps take 2 or 3 battleground countries in Africa. So it's a very powerful card, a very powerful play. And it's one of the sort of mid-war power cards, I guess, for the US player that the USSR has to watch out for. It'll rarely be the case, because it's only worth 2 operations points, that the USSR player can play this and mitigate the impact of it using those 2 operations points. There are some situations where, as the USSR, you've really over-controlled Africa and you don't mind them getting 1 influence in a few different countries. But in general, 4 is a lot of influence, and it's a lot more than 2, and this is going to be a good card for the US player, whoever plays it. It can generally be sent to space, but it's one of a few 2 operations mid-war blue cards that the US player does want to be careful of. And for that reason, if the USSR player gets too far on the space race track and they can no longer space 2 ops cards, then that can be a bit of a problem for them. This card and a number of others as well can cause that. Can cause problems for the USSR player rather, if they get too far on the space race track. Puppet governments is coming off the back of colonial rearguards, which is like, well, it's exactly a US decolonization. Puppet governments is like the US de-Stalinization, but it's a little weaker. It's a little weaker in some ways and a little stronger in others. But in general, it's weaker than de-Stalinization, but it is certainly, on turn 4 and 5, one of the better US cards in the game. It's a starred event, which means it's going to be removed. I should have mentioned Colonial Regards is not starred, so it can come back in the reshuffle. Puppet Governments doesn't require the US player to relocate influence like de-Stalinization, but it has a few more restrictions. So it allows the US player to place 3 influence into countries, so 1 influence in 3 different countries, I should say, that currently contain no influence from either power. So the country must be empty, completely empty, in order for you to place into it with puppet governments. So if you as the US player have managed to deny the USSR player de-Stalinization, they probably won't have influence in South America on turn 4. So if you draw this on turn 4, you can be first into South America using this. So it's really powerful. And just like de-Stalinization, it lets you place without restrictions on placement. So it's any continent, any region in the world. The only restriction is that there must be no existing influence in the country. So it's a little worse than de-Stalinization because de-Stalinization can place into non-US controlled countries. So it can allow you to fill up countries you don't quite control yet as the USSR player, or it can place into contested countries, whereas puppet governments, they must be completely empty. So it's a little more limited, but certainly just like de-Stalinization, the fact that it can go anywhere on the board is extremely powerful, and the earlier in the game that you get it as the US player, the better it's going to be. Placing only 3 as opposed to 4 influence is also a downside, but 3 is still a lot. And certainly as the USSR player, if you draw this on turn 4, 5, sometimes 6, it's going to be one that you pretty much want to center space and don't want to play. You can mitigate it by, obviously, once you get to sort of late in turn 6, turn 7, all of the battleground countries on the board will usually be filled up. And so this will usually end up going into perhaps Afghanistan if that hasn't been filled up. Sometimes Saudi Arabia stays empty the longest out of the battleground countries on the board. Sometimes, it allows you to go into Mexico, although the US player sometimes doesn't even want to place into Mexico. So there are some cases late in the mid-war where the USSR player can comfortably play this and not be too worried and just sort of take the 2 operations and allow the US player to get 3 free operations in non-battlegrounds that aren't particularly relevant. But there will usually be places, so some common places in that situation that you'll see the US player go will be Nicaragua and Haiti, which are adjacent to Cuba. You might also see the 2 countries adjacent to Nigeria, the 2 one stability countries on either side, Saharan states and Cameroon. Puppet governments then allows the US player to set up realigns on battleground countries. So if they're not able to place directly into battleground countries, they may be able to move into one stability non-battlegrounds that allow them favourable realigns. And that's another way that as the US player, you can use the effect of this card, even if there are no battleground countries that are empty and available for you to play into. So in general, very good for the US in the early mid-war, or early on in the mid-war, turn 4 and 5. Not quite as good later in the mid-war and in the late war, but still allows generally for some creative and useful plays. OAS Founded is pretty straightforward. It's just an access card for South and Central America. The US player already has access to Cuba and Mexico naturally because they're adjacent to the US. So this will usually go into Panama or into the South American battleground countries. You can place it into 2 different countries, which is relevant because sometimes you don't want to put all your eggs in one basket. So you might go into Argentina and Chile, or you might go into both of the sub-regions of South America. So you might go 1 Venezuela, 1 to Chile. It's just a really powerful card. It's hard for the USSR player to deal with because it's 1 operations point, so it can't be spaced usually. It's a start event, so it'll get removed. If you're the USSR player, you can sort of hold it longer in the mid-war until you get in, but you're holding a 1 operations card that you're going to have to play at some point. So it does really compromise your hand quality. And so I try to, if I draw it on turn 4 as the USSR, it's pretty unfortunate, but I'll probably just give it to them late in the turn if I can, rather than hold it over to turn 5, 6, 7, because it impairs your ability to draw better cards and have better hands on those later turns by holding it, even if you are bit of a freeze there. Hopefully that didn't freeze the video too much. Shuttle Diplomacy is the next card. So it's a 3 operations blue card. This is a bit confusing because it kind of operates differently to any other card in the game, in that it's set aside once it's played for the event, and then it can be reshuffled, but it's only reshuffled once it's triggered. So it says, play in front of the US player. During the next scoring of Middle East or Asia, whichever comes first, subtract 1 battleground country from the USSR total, then put this card on the discard pile. It doesn't count for final scoring at the end of turn 10. So this makes it less favourable for the Soviet player when Asia and the Middle East are scored, and it makes it easier for the US player to dominate those 2 regions or to even up a region when they're behind. It's rare that you'll see this played for the event by the US player, because 3 operations points is usually enough to cause more of a problem in a battleground country somewhere on the board than the benefit of subtracting 1 battleground country from the USSR at some point in the future when it could be from either of 2 different regions. So it's really only when both Asia and the Middle East are dominated by the USSR by exactly 1 battleground country that you'll see this evented by the US player, because then it's sort of guaranteed to have more of an impact or affect domination in either of those regions when it's scored. You may also play it for the event as the US player when you have one of those scoring cards in hand to follow it up with, and this will affect domination. But otherwise, usually the 3 operations are worth more. And same, the USSR player, rarely will you see a Soviet player spacing this. It does happen in those times when perhaps they have one of the scoring cards in hand and they can't afford to lose a battleground country on that particular turn. So it is certainly affects that changes scoring and therefore affects victory points and therefore can be necessary to space sometimes. But in general, you can sort of cop it as the USSR player, considering you're getting 3 operations out of it. But it's a good card for the US player. It's one of those cards where it's on that borderline, and this is something you'll probably notice throughout these card discussions. If a card is good, but not so good that the opponent is going to space it most of the time or try and get rid of it most of the time, that's kind of the sweet spot, because then you're happy for your opponent to draw it because they're more likely to actually give you the event. And this is one of those ones for the US player where you'll get this event quite often in a game, and it can actually be really beneficial. So I like this as a US player. And as a USSR player, I don't hate it because it doesn't feel like it's like not a crisis that I absolutely have to deal with most of the time. So yeah, it kind of sits in that sweet spot there. Ask Not What Your Country Can Do For You is one of the more powerful US events in the game, one of the most powerful for sure. And it is unique as well in that you'll notice as we go through that most cards have a kind of symmetrical mirror for the other superpower, but Ask Not is one of the ones that doesn't. So there are a few main cards which I'll call out as we go through the mid-war deck that don't have an analogous Soviet card. So Ask Not is one of them. And it says the US player may discard up to their entire hand, including scoring cards, and draw replacements from the deck. The number of cards discarded must be decided prior to drawing replacements. So you look at you play this for the event, you look at your hand, you choose any number of cards, throw them away, and then draw that number back from the deck. So what that allows you to do is multiple things. It allows you to get rid of DEFCON suicide cards like Lone Gunman, which we'll come to in a moment. It allows you to get rid of unfavorable scoring cards, which can be huge VP swings. So you can get rid of, South America scoring where they have control and you don't even have presence, which is worth 10 VPs, and you can just throw it away with this. And it's one of very few cards in the game that lets you do that. I mentioned in the early war 5-year plan is in some ways a red card, even though it's a blue card, because it lets the Soviet player throw away scoring cards. Well, Ask Not is even more powerful than that because it lets you throw away multiple cards. You can do it at any point in your turn, and you can get rid of a combination of bad scoring cards and bad cards in hand. So it's very, very good. You should generally try and hold this until you have Lone Gunman in hand or have an unfavorable scoring card, just because it is such a good safety valve. Sometimes you'll be forced into a conundrum where you've got it in hand, you kind of want to hold it to the next turn, but there's a crisis where 3 operations points would be really useful, and you're like, is it worth more to me to hold this and hope that it's useful later to earn me some VPs, or do I want to earn these VPs now? And you've got to make that choice on a sort of case-by-case basis in each game. But I generally try and hold it because if you play it for the 3 ops and then draw Lone Gunman next turn, you feel pretty miserable. The other thing to be careful about with this is if you play it on as the US player on your 7th action round and you draw a scoring card, you don't have a free action round left to play that scoring card, so you lose the game. So be very careful playing this on your last action round. It can also cause a reshuffle, so you should, before you play it, if you're going to play it on your last action round, check how many cards are left in the deck and make sure that you're not going to trigger a reshuffle, because if you think, oh, there's no scoring cards left in the deck anyway, but you discard 3 cards, or 2 cards, because it's your last action round, say, and you've played the China card, so you discard your last 2 cards, there's only 1 card left in the deck, you draw that card, then reshuffle the discard pile back in, then draw a scoring card as your second card, then you lose the game. So just be really careful using it towards the end of the turn, that you're not going to draw into a scoring card and lose. And even if you play it on your second last action round, if you draw 2 scoring cards, then you don't have enough action rounds left and you can lose the game. So careful of that. Other than that, as the Soviet player, you generally don't want to give this to the US player. You're generally trying to hold it through to turn 8 after the reshuffle and then space it. Maybe play it if you've had Lone Gunman and you know they don't have it. Maybe you'll play it on turn 7. Say you've got Lone Gunman, all the regions in the board are scored, it's late in the turn. Maybe you'll give this to them and let them discard what you assume is probably a good card. I mean, there are plenty of times as a Soviet player where you can get a read on their hand and you kind of go, I think they've probably got a good play on their last action round and they've only got 1 card left. So I'm going to play this, and they're not going to discard their card because they've been holding something good, and that works out fine. So you got to kind of read the tea leaves a bit when you have this as a Soviet player, but a lot of the time you'll try and hold it and set it to space and not give them the opportunity, particularly if you're ahead on tempo. Bear Trap is another one of the really powerful mid-war cards, and it does have a Soviet analogous card, so it's got a twin on the Soviet side. So Bear Trap is a 3 operations card that gets removed from play if it's used as an event, so it's starred. It says, on the next action round, the USSR player must discard an operations card worth 2 or more and roll 1 to 4 on a dice to cancel this event. You repeat it each USSR action round until they're successful at rolling a 1 to 4 and discarding a card, or no eligible cards remain in their hand. If they're out of eligible cards, it says eligible, but it means eligible, the USSR player may only play scoring cards until the next turn. So what this means is your opponent, once you play this as an event, the Soviet player then has to discard a card from their hand that's worth 2 or more and roll a 1 to 4. Otherwise, they don't get to do anything for their action round or their next one, on which they have to do it again. So if they do discard a 2 or more card and roll a 1 to 4, this event is cancelled, but they still lose that 1 action round. So at worst, if you play this as an event, as the US player, your opponent's going to miss out on 1 action round. At best, they're going to roll a 5 or 6, continue to be trapped in the Bear Trap, and then have to do it again on their next action round. If they roll a 5 or 6 again, they have to do it again. So you can make them miss multiple action rounds, which then gives you multiple action rounds in a row. That's extremely powerful, and some people call it the holy grail of Twilight Struggle, to get multiple action rounds in a row, because it lets you do some things that kind of break the game open. Maybe. I mean, sometimes you can't. Even if you've got 2 or 3 action rounds in a row, sometimes you're so far behind you can't break the game open. But it can let you flip, 1 region on the board or 1 crucial battleground country most of the time. The usual case scenario, though, of playing this, say, in the middle of a turn, and then they discard a 2 or more operations card and roll a 1 to 4, and then it's cancelled, you've spent a 3 operations card and your action round to deny them 1 action round. You've also made them discard a card, but they can discard one of your cards. So they could discard a really bad US event. They could discard Colonial Rearguards or Grain Sales to Soviets or Voice of America, which we'll come to in a minute, to the Bear Trap, which might actually be a benefit to them to get that card out of their hand. So you have to kind of be a bit careful about how you use this. There are a few ways that it can be really good. So one is if you know they've got a scoring card, for instance, because you've played CIA Created, or they've played CIA Created that turn, and you know their hand, and you can sort of deprive them of an action round towards the end of the turn, just before they're going to play the scoring card. So they have to, discard that 4 ops card that they've been holding back, or discard that Brush War, or that ABM treaty. And then you get an action round where you can sort of break their domination or whatever, or establish your own domination, and then they have to play the scoring card the following round. That can be really good. The other way that it can be really nice is to play it as the US player on your 7th action round, because then it carries over to the next turn. They get to do a headline, but then they have to play into the bear trap on their 1st action round. So I guess those are the two ways that it can be beneficial, either to steal the coup on the following turn, hopefully, by depriving them of their 1st action round, or to squeeze them at the end of a turn when you either have an inkling about what you think they want to play. So if you think they've got a good Soviet card or a good neutral card and you make them discard it towards the end of their turn, or if you know they've got a scoring card or you think they've got a scoring card and you want to deprive them of their action round 6, so their penultimate action round, before they play the scoring card, if you think that they wanted to use that to affect the scoring in that region. As the Soviet player, this is one that you really can't play on yourself. Like, the only time you will is if you have multiple DEFCON suicide cards or multiple cards that are just so bad for you. Like if you've got Voice of America, Colonial Rearguards, Puppet Governments, and Ask Not left in your hand, you might go, oh, okay, I'll bear trap myself because those are basically empty action rounds anyway. I'm giving my opponent more advantage out of them than I would get from the operations. So I'll just play bear trap and I'll just try and pitch as many of those cards as I can to the bear trap. That may be when you do it, but other than that, it's usually going to go to space. Panama Canal Returned is a 1 operations card, which is another one to pay attention to because 1-ops cards can't be spaced, so they'll generally have to be played if they're not held over. It says add 1 US influence in Panama, Costa Rica, and Venezuela. So Panama and Costa Rica are both in Central America. The US starts with an influence in Panama, so that access to Panama and Costa Rica is not hugely beneficial most of the time, unless the US player gets couped out of Panama on turn 1, which does happen quite a bit of the time. So it lets you get back into that crucial Central American battleground. The influence in Venezuela, though, is really important, because if you draw this on turn 4 and nobody's got into South America yet because you've denied them destalinization, then Panama Canal Returned can let you get into Venezuela. If you do it once DEFCON's reduced to 2, then there's fewer opportunities for the Soviet player to coup you out of Venezuela before you can spread to Brazil and at least solidify 2 battleground countries in South America. And in general, it's just another really good access card for the US player. As the Soviet player, you want to kind of hold this as long as you can. It's got the same rider as OAS Founded, that the longer you hold it through multiple turns, the more you're diluting the power of your hand on those subsequent turns, because you're holding this card that it either has to be a hold card or you have to play it. You're never going to be able to space it. So if you draw another card that you need to hold more, or is more powerful for the US player, then you're probably going to have to play this anyway. So you might want to just get it out of your hand to give you some more flexibility later. But there are some game situations where you just can't do that. So it's a powerful one for the US player. It can be a pain for the USSR to handle, but sometimes you just need to take your medicine and play it because it is a 1-op card and it's hard to get rid of. Grain sales to Soviets. So it says, it's a 2-ops card. It says randomly choose 1 card from the USSR hand, play it or return it. If Soviet player has no cards or returned, or the card is returned, use this card to conduct operations normally. So this is, again, one of the asymmetrical cards in that there's no Soviet equivalent, and it's extremely powerful. So you're choosing 1 card from their hand and you get to play it. So if it's random, so if you're playing it on Playdeck, on the online version, it'll just randomly show you one of their cards. If you're playing in real life, they put their hand face down and you randomly select one of them. You can either play that card, which means that if it's a really good card, like a neutral event or a US event that you want to play, you can do that. Or you can play it for, it might be a scoring card that you want to play. Generally, you won't play scoring cards, though, off this, because you want to give it back to them because they have to play the scoring card this turn anyway. What you can do, though, with this is coup. So if you headline this as the US player, you can use that card to conduct operations. So you can coup with it. You can send it to space if you want to. You can do all sorts of things. So when it says play it, it means play it as though you were playing it from your hand. So you get all the same options as you have if you had it in your hand. The only time that you'd return a card is if it's a Soviet event that you don't want to trigger, or if it's a low operations event, like say it's a 1-op Soviet card or even a 1-op US card, and you really need a 2-op card, then you might play grain sales instead. The amazing thing about grain sales is that even if you don't play that card that they've shown you from their hand, you still get to play grain sales as though you'd played it as a 2-op card, to conduct operations normally, in the words of the card. So that means that if you headline it, you get to play 2 operations in your headline phase. And again, it's as though you played it in an action round, so you can coup with it, you can realign with it, you can do whatever you want. So it's a very powerful card. It basically gives you an additional action round that turn if you played in the headline phase, and it also cuts their hand size by 1 if you don't return the card from their hand. So if you take a card from their hand and you play it, you've actually cut their hand size by 1, which can cause them all sorts of issues with DEFCON, particularly if they don't have the China card. As the USSR player, this is avoid at all costs, must space, never play this, because it's a DEFCON suicide card, because you give the US player the opportunity to coup in your action round. And if DEFCON's at 2, they can make you lose the game. You're also giving them another card from your hand. So if you play grain sales, you give them a card from your hand potentially, cutting your own hand size, and you give them the opportunity to, even if DEFCON's at 3, you give them the opportunity to coup in your action round, which is terrible. So in most cases, this is going to be a space. The only time you'll ever play it is if you're too far advanced on the space race or you're under Red Scare Purge. DEFCON's still at 3. This is the only DEFCON suicide card you have in hand, and you just need to get rid of it. But that's a pretty dire situation for the Soviet player, and it's very rare that you'll see the Soviets play this card. So it's very, very powerful for the US. Nixon plays the China card is one of the less powerful cards, although still important. So it says, if the US has the China card, the US gets 2 VP, which is pretty good. 2 VPs on any card is quite a lot. Like, that's only 1 less than you get for dominating the Middle East with dominating by 1 country. So it's, like a mini scoring card, if you like. Otherwise, the US player receives the China card now, face down and unavailable for immediate play. So if the USSR player has the China card, they have to give it to you face down as though they'd played it. This can be really important because denying them control of the China card can be quite huge. So this is just one of those. There are 3 cards in the mid-war deck that cause the China card to be handed between the players. This is one of them. And it's just important to keep in mind, if you're the Soviet player and you're holding on to the China card, just be aware that there are 2 cards in the US mid-war deck that force you to hand it over. And likewise, if you're the US player and you've been holding on to the China card for ages, be aware of the one in the USSR deck, which is Cultural Revolution, that forces you to hand it over to the USSR player. So, yep, just really important to be aware of those because the China card can be quite important for hand size management. The Voice of America is the next one. So it's a 2 operations points card. So again, can be spaced up to a point, but once you get past, I think it's man in space, you can no longer space Voice of America. So you need to be careful of that as the Soviet player because this effect is very powerful and you'll generally want to send this to space if you're the Soviets, because this is, while I said Ask Not was one of the best US events in the game and Grain Sales to Soviets is probably the best US event in the game, Voice of America is on the same level, if not just behind. It says remove 4 USSR influence from non-European countries. No more than 2 may be removed from any one country. So you can imagine this is extremely powerful as a headline. It's extremely powerful as an action round 7 play. And the time when it is absolutely devastating is action round 7 on turn 10, because that's right before final scoring. And the USSR player has absolutely no chance to respond to it before final scoring occurs. Removing 4 influence from any countries outside of Europe generally means that you can flip 1, if not 2 regions. Because unless they've over-controlled all their battlegrounds, you might be able to deprive them of 2 battleground countries in 2 different regions, which is usually going to be enough to flip those regions. So Voice of America is very, very powerful, an amazing turn 10 action round 7 play, but just in general, an amazing action round 7 play and an amazing headline. So yeah, just a really good card for the Americans and one that the USSR has to space most of the time. Alliance for Progress 3 operations points means that this will usually be played by the USSR player. It's also starred, which means that it's removed, as opposed to the analogous event on the Soviet side, OPEC, which comes back. This says US gains 1 VP for each US-controlled battleground country in Central America and South America. If you're the Soviets and you draw this on turn 4, the US player may have no battlegrounds in Central or South America, so they may just score nothing, and you can go on your merry way, play this for 3 operations, and get it out of the deck forever. That happens quite a bit. On sort of turn 4 and 5, this will come out in the Soviet hand, and it's gone for very little damage. Most of the time, though, you'll see it played for 1 or 2 victory points. Occasionally, the US gets really far ahead, and they, dominate South America and have 2 or 3 battlegrounds in Central America. And then this might be a 4 or 5 victory point card, in which case the Soviet player will not play it. They'll space it, and the US player will be very pleased to draw it at that point and play it for the event. But as the US, you'll generally play this because it's unlikely that you're going to get sort of 3 or more most of the time. You'll generally play this for operations and try and leave it in the deck to get reshuffled for later. But if you do happen to draw it in the late war as the US and you've got an advantageous position in South America and Central America, then you'll usually play it for the event and take the victory points. Kitchen Debates is another 1-op card, but it's the weakest of the US 1-op cards. It says, if the US controls more battleground countries than the USSR, poke the opponent in the chest and gain 2 victory points. So you have to control more battleground countries than the USSR across the whole board, and then you get 2 VPs. So if you're the US player and this is live, so you do control more battlegrounds across the board, you'll generally take the 2 VPs, because that's better than 1 operations, almost all of the time. There'll be some edge cases where it's not, but it usually is. As the Soviet player, if you're behind on battleground countries across the board in the mid-war, then you're probably in a really rough situation in the game, because you should be ahead at that point. So you can usually get rid of this just as a 1-op card, and it's bad because it's a 1-op action round and you'd rather have more operations points, but it's not too bad because you'll generally not be giving them 2 VPs. If you are giving them 2 VPs from it, you'll probably have to cop it just like the other 1-op cards because you can't space it, but most of the time you won't have to. Camp David Accords is a kind of one of those ones like Shuttle Diplomacy where the Soviet player will often play it and often not space it, but it's really good. So it says, we'll start at the bottom, Arab-Israeli War event is no longer playable. So after this is evented, Arab-Israeli War, which is a recurring USSR event that comes in the early war deck, is no longer playable, which means that the US can safely fill up Israel without worrying about being flipped by the war. And it also crucially denies the Soviet player the opportunity to get mil-ops points from Arab-Israeli War. The US also gets a victory point, which is great, and they get 3 influence, so 1 in Israel, 1 in Jordan, and 1 in Egypt, all of which are important countries. 2 of them are battleground countries, and yeah, it's a great access card. Gets you a victory point along the way, and it denies the Soviets the opportunity to play Arab-Israeli War. So a very, very powerful card. It's a start event, so it goes away. The Soviets can certainly play it and repair the damage, or most of the damage, with the 2 operations points. But yeah, it's one that you'll often see the Soviets play and just accept that it's going to happen, rather than spacing, because there are so many other priorities in the mid-war deck for space. John Paul is another one that is a good one to space, for a couple of reasons. Obviously, it's analogous to de Gaulle leads France from the early war deck, but for Poland instead. So it's removed 2 USSR influence in Poland and then add 1 US influence in Poland. It's exactly the same text as de Gaulle leads France, just transposed across to Poland. The difference is that it's only 2 ops rather than 3. So for the Soviet player, they actually have to over-control Poland in order to be able to still control it at the end of an action round in which they have this event occur. Whereas with de Gaulle leads France, you can repair all the damage that it does just using the operations points on the card. That's not the case for John Paul II elected Pope. It also allows the play of Solidarity, which is a late war card that we'll come to later, that adds 3 US influence in Poland. So that's probably the main reason, along with the asymmetry of the effect and the operations points on the card, that you'll want to space John Paul, because denying them the opportunity to play Solidarity later, or making sure Solidarity doesn't occur in the late war, is actually quite important. And so, yeah, you'll often prioritize spacing John Paul over something like Nixon or Camp David Accords or shuttle diplomacy because it is quite powerful and it affects a country that's quite important on the board. Sadat expels Soviets, remove all USSR influence in Egypt, and add 1 US influence. So this is one that is almost always going to occur in the mid-war because it's a one operations card. So as the US player and the USSR player, you should be aware of this. And you'll often see that although the USSR gets Egypt early through NASA in the early war deck, and that's always going to happen because it's a one operations card, Sadat reverses that and it kicks the Soviets out completely and puts 1 US influence in. So that what that means is that because NASA only removes half rounded down of US influence in the early war, if you're the US player and you play 2 into Egypt on turn 1, then NASA gets played, 1 of your 2 gets removed and 2 Soviet influence gets added. At some point in the mid-war, all of their influence is going to get removed by Sadat and you're going to get 1 extra, which if you've still got 1 sitting in there, is going to give you enough for control. So that's why you'll often see a lot of US players play 2 influence into Egypt on turn 1, because it gives them first access to Libya, and even once NASA happens, Sadat will sort of repair the damage and give them control of Egypt. So it's an important one to be aware of, important to think about, and know that it's coming. And yeah, if you're the USSR player, don't go crazy placing influence into Egypt. Usuri River Skirmish is another of the China card cards. So it's different to Nixon in that if the USSR player has the China card, you get it face up and available for play rather than face down. So if you're the US player and your hand size is a bit squeezed and you've like got a DEFCON suicide card and you've had your hand size reduced and you're a bit scared about maybe committing DEFCON suicide, Usuri River Skirmish can let you take the China card, which gives you an extra action round because it's face up, so you can then play the China card on your subsequent action round to sort of free up your hand size a little bit and let you hold an extra card at the end of the turn. The other thing that you can do with it is just taking the China card might deny your opponent hand size, so you might be trying to kill them with something like terrorism. You know that they've got, grand sales to Soviets in hand and they can't space it, and you just want to take the China card off them so they can't play it. You can use a River Skirmish to do that. And maybe you just want the China card in general. You might use it for that effect. The other part of the effect is that if you already have the China card as the US player, you get to add 4 US influence in Asia, no more than 2 per country. So you could put 2 into North Korea, 2 into Pakistan, or 2 into Pakistan, 2 into Thailand. Very powerful effect. Amazing on action round 7, just like Voice of America. And it can go anywhere in Asia, no adjacency rules, just like, decolonization, destalinization. Very, very powerful. You can place it into countries that your opponent controls with no restrictions. So if your opponent controls North Korea, they have 3 there, and you're the US player, you can put 2 in there using this card's effect, even though it's controlled. You don't need to pay 2 influence for the first one, if that makes sense. So it's a really powerful effect. Generally, as the Soviets, because again, it's only 3 operations value card, but it places 4 influence. You can't repair all the damage from it using its operations value, so you'll generally not be able to play it comfortably, unlike something like de Gaulle leads France or socialist governments, where the impact on the board is equal with the operations value of the card. This one, the impact, so what the US player gets out of it, is higher than the operations value, which is 3. So the USSR player will generally not be able to comfortably play this, even just sort of as an empty action round, because they can't repair the damage. So generally you'll see the USSR spacing this. Generally you'll see the US... I tend to not play it for the event most of the time. I tend to use it just as a 3-op card, because that, for me, tends to often accomplish more. Sometimes I'll headline it, although the impact of the upgraded version, so that if you already have the China card version, tends not to be so good as the US player, and it's more painful for the Soviet player if they draw it, if that makes sense. So I often just want to play it for the operations points and let it go back into the deck in the hope that they draw it later and then have to try and manage it in their hand. Our Man in Tehran is a 2 operations US event. It says, if the US controls at least 1 Middle East country, the US player draws the top 5 cards from the draw pile. So the first thing to note is you have to have at least one country in the Middle East for this event to do anything. They may reveal and discard any or all of these drawn cards without triggering the event. Any remaining drawn cards are returned to the draw deck and it's reshuffled. So you can discard scoring cards, you can discard favourable Soviet cards. It's quite powerful. Again, asymmetrical, there's no Soviet to this in the mid-war deck. 5 cards is quite significant a lot of the time once you get towards sort of turn 6 and 7. And if there's, for instance, one scoring card that hasn't been drawn yet on turn 7 and you know is going to be drawn on turn 8 or you know is remaining in the deck, you might event Our Man in Tehran just in the hope that you hit it and get rid of it. That's probably the main reason that you'd play it as an event as the US player, because in general, giving up 2 operations points to speculatively maybe hit something important is probably not a great return on your operations points. But certainly as the Soviet player, as we've discussed through the rest of the mid-war deck, there are so many US events that are so problematic for you that you just simply can't play or don't want to play in your action round, that you're rarely going to have the space, or the time rather, to space Our Man in Tehran. So you'll often find yourself playing it and letting the US have the event. And certainly as the US player, much like I said with Shuttle Diplomacy, and much like I said with Camp David Accords, those are the kind of middle tier of US cards where you'll often get the event and you'll often be pretty happy about it. So you'll often see this as the US player, your opponent triggering this. It may sometimes get you a benefit, but if you draw it, it'll generally just be a 2 operations card. So I think we're going to end this video there. We're already 45 minutes, so we'll come back with the neutral cards and the USSR cards in a separate video. I think we should be able to get through those a little more quickly because I've done a bit more of the foregrounding, I guess, on the mid-war landscape. And I do think that the US cards are and the neutral cards, there are 3 very powerful neutral cards, which we'll come to in the next video. But certainly the US and the neutral cards define the mid-war far more than the USSR cards do. The USSR cards really defined the early war, as we saw in the last video. De-Stalinization, decolonization, De Gaulle leads France, Suez Crisis. These are all extremely powerful USSR events, blockade, that define that early war deck. Whereas in the mid-war, it's things like grain sales to Soviets, Colonial rearguards, Ask Not, Voice of America, even Sadat expels Soviets, can have quite an impact, puppet governments, OAS founded, Panama Canal. These are all great access cards. They're all great power cards. And they often define what happens in the mid-war, along with the neutral cards, far more than the USSR events do. But anyway, we'll come back in the next video with the neutral and the USSR cards. Until then, I've been Jesse Marshall for The Winning Agenda, and I hope that you're enjoying our new player primer. This has been part 4, the USA mid-war cards. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.